What if that nagging feeling in the back of your neck was real? What if those hands reaching out from the dark that you believed were there? What if the monster in the basement really existed? And what if there was really something under the bed? Would you have the courage to face your fears?
I should have known something was wrong when Mrs. Henderson's cat went missing. The elderly Tabby never strayed far from her front porch. But that morning, there was no sign of him. Just an overturned flower pot and strange marks in the soil. I was running late for my shift at the hospital anyway, so I didn't give it much thought. That was my first mistake. As an ER nurse, I've seen my fair share of bizarre cases, but nothing could have prepared me for what that day would bring. The first patient came in around 10 a.m. High fever, disorientation, and an unusual bite mark on his forearm. He claimed a homeless man had attacked him in the subway, but the wound looked wrong. The edges were black, and the veins around it had turned a sickly shade of green. Dr. Martinez ordered broad-spectrum antibiotics and had him admitted for observation. By noon, we had 3 more cases with similar symptoms. The waiting room was filling up with people showing signs of fever, and security had to break up 2 fights between patients who were becoming increasingly aggressive. I noticed some of the staff whispering amongst themselves, and the word quarantine started floating around. I was checking on the first patient when everything went sideways. His fever had spiked to 106, and no amount of medication seemed to help. His skin had taken on a gray pallor, and his eyes. God, his eyes. The pupils had expanded so much that the iris was barely visible. Just a thin ring of brown around bottomless black pools. I was updating his chart when he flatlined. Standard procedure. I called the code and started chest compressions. Dr. Martinez rushed in with the crash cart. But before we could do anything else, the patient's eyes snapped open. What happened next still haunts me. He lunged at Martinez with inhuman speed, sinking his teeth into the doctor's neck. I froze for a split second, the longest second of my life, before hitting the panic button. The patient, no, the thing that used to be our patient, turned its head toward me, blood dripping from its mouth. I ran. I ran like hell, slamming the door behind me and screaming for security. But as I looked down the hallway, I realized with horror that ours wasn't the only room where things had gone wrong. Screams echoed through the corridors. The overhead speakers cracked to life, announcing a facility-wide lockdown. That was 3 hours ago. Now I'm barricaded in the pharmacy with 4 other staff members and a teenage patient. We blocked the doors with everything we could find. We can hear them out there. The scratching, the moaning, the occasional burst of gunfire from what I hope is law enforcement. My phone has no signal. But before it went dead, I saw the news. It's not just our hospital. It's the whole damn city. Maybe more. The sun is setting now, and the backup generators just kicked in. Sarah, one of the residents, is trying to get the radio working. Mike, our security guard, is taking inventory of our supplies. The others are either sleeping or trying to. Nobody's talking about what we all know. Eventually, we'll need to leave this room. I keep thinking about Mrs. Henderson's cat, about how many other warning signs we must have missed, about how quickly normal turned into a nightmare, and about how this might only be the beginning. The radio crackled to life around midnight. Through the static, we caught fragments of an emergency broadcast. Remain indoors. Military response. Quarantine zones. Then nothing but white noise. Sarah slumped against the wall, still clutching the radio. That's it? That's all they're going to tell us? I was about to respond when a crash echoed from somewhere down the hall, followed by the sounds of breaking glass. Mike raised his finger to his lips and tightened his grip on the security baton. His firearm had run out of ammunition hours ago. The teenage patient, Danny, had been quiet since we barricaded ourselves in here. Now he spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. My mom. She was in the waiting room when everything went crazy. I need to know if she's okay. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the slight tremor running through his body. The fever he'd come in with was finally breaking, thank God. At least it wasn't the same thing that had turned the others. We'll find her, I promised, knowing it might be a lie. The pharmacy's fluorescent lights flickered, reminding us that the backup generators wouldn't last forever. I did another inventory of our supplies. Antibiotics, painkillers, various other medications that might or might not be useful. No food except for a few protein bars from Sarah's locker. No water except for a half-empty cooler. Through the small window in the door, I could see shadows moving in the hallway. They weren't the methodical patrols of rescue workers. These movements were jerky and erratic. Every few minutes, one of them would slam against our barricade, making the whole door shudder. We need a plan, Lisa, one of the nurses from pediatrics, said. She'd been writing something in a small notebook since we got here. The generators won't last more than a day. We need supplies, and we need to find more secure location. She was right, of course. The pharmacy had saved our lives in the short term, but it was a dead end, literally, if we stayed too long. I unfolded the hospital floor plan I'd grabbed during our initial escape. The cafeteria is 2 floors down. It would have food, water, maybe even some supplies. The problem is it's through the main corridor, Mike finished, where we last saw at least 30 of those things. A loud bang made us all jump. One of them hit the floor harder than before. Through the window, I could see a glimpse of a face I recognized. Nurse Chen from the ICU. Her skin was gray, her scrubs covered in blood. As she turned toward the window, her milky eyes seemed to stare right at me. They're getting more aggressive, Mike observed. The barricade won't last forever. I looked at our small group. Mike with his baton, Sarah still holding the useless radio, Lisa with her notebook, and Danny, just a kid caught up in this nightmare. We had no weapons except for a few scalpels and some chemical sprays from the cleaning supplies. But we did have one advantage: knowledge of the hospital's layout, including some paths that weren't on the official floor plans. During my night shifts, I discovered that the old pneumatic tube system, decommissioned years ago, had maintenance tunnels running alongside it. They were tight, dark, and probably haven't been open in years. But they might be our only chance. I have an idea, I said, pulling them into a huddle. But you're not going to like it. Another bang at the door, louder this time. We were out of options and out of time. What I didn't tell them was that I'd seen something else through that window. Fire is burning in the city beyond the hospital. Whatever was happening here wasn't contained, and I had a feeling that getting out of the hospital would only be the beginning of our struggles. But first, we had to survive the night. Moving the storage cabinet hiding the maintenance tunnel entrance made more noise than we'd hoped for. The scraping sound drew immediate attention. The banging on the pharmacy door intensified, accompanied by what I can only describe as eager moans. Hurry, Mike whispered, straining against the cabinet's weight. The ancient metal access panel behind it was rusted at the edges, but the handle turned with a reluctant squeal. Sarah went first, her phone's flashlight illuminating the narrow passage. The beam caught years of cobwebs and dust, but no movement, no threats. Lisa helped Danny through next, then followed herself. I grabbed as many supplies as I could stuff into my scrub's pocket, mostly medications I'd hoped we wouldn't need. The door hinges were starting to give. Go, Mike urged, practically shoving me toward the tunnel. I'll be right behind you. The passage was even tighter than I'd remembered from my curious explorations during slow night shifts. We had to move single file, hunched over to avoid the pipes running overhead. The air was stale, thick with decades of undisturbed dust that clung to the sweat on my face. Sarah's light bounced off the curved walls, creating shifting shadows that made my heart jump every few seconds. Behind me, I heard Mike pulling the access panel shut, followed by his labored breathing as we joined our procession. These tunnels, Danny whispered, between coughs. Where do they go? They branch throughout the hospital, I explained, trying to sound more confident than I felt. This section should take us down to the sub-basement. From there, we can access the parking garage. That was the plan, anyway. What I didn't mention was that I'd only explored the first 100 feet or so of these tunnels before. The rest was a guess based on old maintenance maps I'd seen in the facility's office. We came to a junction, the tunnel splitting 3 ways. I was about to suggest taking the right path when we heard it, a skittering sound from the left tunnel, like nails on metal. Sarah's light swung toward the noise. For a split second, I saw something dart back into the darkness, something that moved low to the ground on all fours. "What's that?" Lisa's voice trailed off. "Mrs. Henderson's cat," I finished grimly. Except it couldn't be. What I'd seen was hairless, its skin a sickly gray like the infected above. The skittering grew louder, multiplied. "Run!" Mike shouted, abandoning any presence of stealth. We scrambled down the right tunnel, no longer caring about the noise we made. Sarah's light bounced wildly, creating a strobing effect that made the passage seem to twist and writhe around us. The sounds behind us grew closer, not just skittering now, but high-pitched yowls that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Danny stumbled. I caught him before he could fall, practically dragging him as we ran. The tunnel began to slope downward, the floor becoming treacherously slick with some kind of moisture. Lisa screamed. In the chaos of the shadows, I saw something clinging to her back, a grotesque parody of a cat, all exposed muscle and protruding bones. She slammed herself against the wall, crushing it with a sickening crunch. But more shapes were emerging from the darkness. Mike swung his baton, connecting with one of the creatures mid-leap. "There's a maintenance room ahead," he shouted. "I can see the sign." 20 feet. 10. The creatures were all around us now, a writhing mass of twisted feline forms. Sarah reached the door first, yanking it open. We piled through as Mike swung the baton in wide arcs, keeping the horde at bay. The door clanged shut behind us. Lisa and I immediately pressed our backs against it while Sarah frantically searched for a lock. The metal vibrated with impacts from the other side. "There!" Danny pointed to a heavy pipe lying in the corner. We threaded it through the door handle, creating a makeshift barricade. In the relative safety of the maintenance room, we finally got a good look at each other. Lisa's back was shredded, her scrubs soaked with blood. "I'm okay," she insisted, though her face was pale. "It's not deep." But we'd all seen how fast the infection spread above. Sarah's light revealed that we were in some kind of pump room. Ancient machinery cast long shadows on the walls. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. And there, on the far wall, was another door marked Parking Level B2. We were halfway to our goal. But as I looked at Lisa's wounds, then at the terror on Danny's face, I wondered how many of us would make it to the rest of the way. A new sound reached us from the door, not the yowling of the infected cats, but something larger, something that moved with purpose. We weren't alone down here, and whatever else had found its way into these tunnels, it was coming closer. The rhythmic dripping of water marked time as we watched Lisa's condition deteriorate. Within an hour, her skin had taken on a waxy sheen, and dark lines were spreading from the scratches on her back like ink through wet paper. "You need to leave me behind," she said, her voice steady, despite the fever I could feel burning through her skin. Always a practical one, even now. "No," Danny protested. "You should stay. You said we need to stay together. You promised." Lisa managed a weak smile. "Sometimes promises have to bend so that people can survive." She pressed her notebook into Danny's hand. "I want you to have this. I've been writing down everything I've observed about the infection, the progression, the symptoms. Maybe it'll help someone figure this out." A crash echoed from somewhere in the darkness beyond our shelter, followed by the sound of metal being dragged across concrete. Whatever was down here with us was getting closer. "We can't just leave you," Sarah whispered, though I could see in her eyes that she knew we might have to. I pulled out the medications I've grabbed from the pharmacy. Morphine, antibiotics, a handful of sedatives. None of them would stop what was happening to Lisa, but they might make it easier. "How long?" Mike asked quietly. "Based on what we saw upstairs," I checked Lisa's pulse. Rapid, thready. "Maybe an hour. Less if the animal infection spreads faster." Another crash, closer this time. A deep, guttural sound that was neither human nor animal resonated through the pipes. Lisa gripped my hand. I don't want to become one of them. Please. I understood what she was asking. As a nurse, I'd sworn to do no harm. But we'd seen what happened to Dr. Martinez, to Nurse Chen, to all the others. This wasn't harm. It was mercy. My hand brushed against the syringe of morphine in my pocket. The rest of you should go, I said. I'll catch up. Sarah started to protest, but Mike grabbed her arm. He'd seen enough death today to understand. They moved toward the door leading to the parking level. Danny looked back with tears streaming down his face. It's okay, Lisa called after him. Everything has to end sometime. Just remember to keep writing. Keep observing. Someone has to tell this story. Once they were gone, I prepared the syringe. My hands were steady, steadier than they had any right to be. Thank you, Lisa whispered as I found a vein. Just stay with me until it's done. I held her hand as her breathing slowed, as her eyes fluttered closed, waiting until I was sure. Then I did what was needed to be done to ensure she wouldn't come back. When I finally stepped through the door into the parking level, the others were waiting. Nobody asked questions. They didn't need to. The parking garage stretched out before us, a forest of concrete pillars disappearing into shadows. Dozens of abandoned cars creating a maze of potential hiding places. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly red glow. And there, across the expanse of the garage, was the exit ramp. Daylight filtered down from above, the first natural light we'd seen in what felt like years. But between us and freedom, dark shapes moved in the red-tinted darkness. The dragging sound was louder here, accompanied by the click of claws on concrete. We'd have to cross the entire garage to reach the exit. No more maintenance tunnels. No more hiding. Sarah checked her phone's battery. 15% left. It was the only light we had. Mike gripped his blood-stained baton. Stay close, move fast, and don't look back. Danny clutched Lisa's notebook to his chest like a shield. I thought about the morphine syringe, now empty. About Lisa's last peaceful breath. About how many more impossible choices lay ahead of us. We stepped out of the doorway shelter and into the garage proper. Somewhere in the shadows, something big heard us coming. The race for survival was about to begin. The first car alarm went off when we were halfway across the garage. The sound bounced off concrete walls, creating a cacophony that made it impossible to track the movements in the shadows. Sarah's phone light swept across abandoned vehicles, catching glimpses of dark stains and broken windows. Then we saw it. In the crimson emergency lighting, its white hospital gown was pink, like something dipped in blood. Dr. Martinez, or what was left of him, had grown. His frame had twisted, joints bulging and realigned, forcing him to move in a horrible crouch-drag motion. The skin on his face had pulled back in a permanent snarl, and his teeth... "Don't run," Mike whispered. "Not yet." Martinez's head snapped toward us, nostrils flaring. Other shapes emerged from between the cars. Former patients, staff, all transformed into something barely recognizable as human. But Martinez was different. Evolved. Danny whimpered. I squeezed his shoulder, feeling him trembling. The thing that had been Martinez took a step forward, dragging one grotesquely muscled leg. A sound came from its throat, not the mindless moaning of the others, but something closer to words. Hungry. Sarah's phone light flickered. 5% battery. Everything happened at once. Martinez lunged, covering an impossible distance. Mike shoved me and Danny aside as claws raked through the air where we'd been standing. Sarah screamed and ran, her light bouncing wildly, disorienting everyone, infected and survivors alike. "The ramp!" I shouted, pulling Danny with me. "Run!" Mike swung his baton, connecting with Martinez's jaw. The creature's head snapped back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it grabbed the baton and yanked, lifting Mike off his feet. "Go!" Mike roared. pulling a flare from his belt, his last resort. "I'll hold him!" The flare ignited, bathing everything in harsh light. The infected recoiled, giving us our chance, and we ran. Sarah reached the ramp first. Danny and I were about 20 feet behind. I could hear Mike yelling, heard the wet sound of impact, and then silence. The ramp seemed endless. Sarah's phone finally dead, plunging us into darkness broken only by the distant daylight above and the fading flare below. Our footsteps echoed, along with other sounds. Pursuit. Danny stumbled, and I caught him. But something caught me. A hand, corpse cold, gripping my ankle. I kicked blindly, felt something crack, and I kept running. "Almost there!" Sarah called from behind. The daylight grew brighter. 10 more steps. 5. We burst out into the morning sun, temporarily blinded. The street was chaos. Overturned cars, broken glass, distant sirens. But there, a block away, I could see military vehicles. A quarantine checkpoint. A roar from behind us. Martinez emerged from the ramp, smoke rising from his burned flesh where the sun touched it. The thing that had been our doctor charged, faster than anything broken should move. Sarah screamed a warning. I turned, pushing Danny behind me. In that moment, I saw Martinez's ruined face inches from mine, smelled his rotting breath. Then his head exploded. The military checkpoint had spotted us. The sound of gunfire was deafening. Martinez's body crumpled. More shots. More infected falling. A vehicle screeched toward us, soldiers yelling for us to get in. As they pulled us to safety, I looked back at the hospital, at the building where I'd worked for 6 years, where I'd saved lives and lost them. Black smoke poured from several floors. The entire east wing is on fire. "Are you bit?" a soldier demanded, checking us over. "Scratched?" "No," I said, then remembered my ankle. I pulled up my scrubs leg, expecting the worst. Just bruises. I'd been lucky. 3 survivors from Memorial Hospital, another soldier was reporting into a radio. Taking them to Green Zone 2. Danny was still clutching Lisa's notebook. Sarah was crying. The tension of the last 12 hours finally breaking. Through the vehicle's window, I watched my city burn. "What happens now?" Danny asked quietly. I thought about Mike's sacrifice, about Lisa's notebook, about everything we'd seen and lost. "Now we survive," I said. "And we make sure Lisa's observations get to someone who can help. We tell our story. We fight back." The military vehicle sped through the streets I barely recognized, taking us toward whatever safety remained in this broken world. Behind us, more explosions lit up the hospital. Maybe they were trying to contain the infected. Maybe they were just destroying the evidence. I didn't know if we'd ever understand what started this, if we'd find a cure, or if this was humanity's new reality. But I knew one thing. This wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a different kind of war. And somewhere in the city, I could still hear car alarms ringing, like bells tolling for the end of the world we'd known. I hope you enjoyed that story. Click right here and it'll take you to more zombie stories if you're interested. But come back next time for some more scary stories. And as always, remember to face your fears.